Welcome to week 3 of Ethics through St. Edward's. This is a week devoted to Immanuel Kant, an 18th century German philosopher and part of the Enlightenment. You should refer to the outline that's in the file section called Outline for Kantian Ethics. I'm going to show you that on the screen right now. This outline covers all of the readings we have for this week. I'm going to thread together different dimensions, different parts of those outlines so that you can follow along. So have the outline handy and 3 of the texts which I'll refer to that are in Canvas. And we will work together to make sense of Kant's contribution to Western ethics. So first thing I want to say is Kant is an Enlightenment philosopher. If you've had Western European history at some point, you know the Enlightenment was a period of focusing on reason, the idea being our most central defining feature, that is, of human beings, is our reasoning capacity, our ability to think and reason. The scientific revolution reaches its apogee here during the Enlightenment. Of course, the framers of the American constitutional project, despite all their faults, thought that with reason alone we could deduce the natural rights and legal framework for the American Republic. Kant is squarely in that tradition. Referring to my outline A1, if there are only 3 things you remember about Kant by the end of our time today, they should be reason as being our defining central feature, or what Kant calls our rational nature. Kant believes that reason dictates that we should have certain consistent rules that apply to everyone in the similar situations equally. That is, if I'm in a situation that you're in and vice versa, we need to follow the same rules out of respect for one another as acting, choosing agents. So defining features of reason, we need consistent rules that apply equally to everybody. People are in comparably situated circumstances. And the reason we do that is to respect others as choosers and actors, right? We don't necessarily think of them as moral actors because of how they feel, or their race, or their color, or their gender, or their nationality, or their orientation. Those things are not unimportant. But as a matter of morality, we want to treat everybody the same. And Kant thinks he's got the key for that. So that's sort of our task for today. I'm going to skip over now to Canvas to read the overview, where I've already, sorry, that's a different text. So Kant's categorical comparative, unlike Mill's, is not primarily focused on outcomes or consequences. That theme shows up again and again in Kant and Kantian reading. It's not about pleasure and pain. Again, those things are not unimportant, but as the basis of morality, Kantian would say those things, pleasure and pain and outcomes, difficult to predict, inconstant, are poor grounds for moral judgment. Instead, I'm reading here from the overview, Kant argues morality requires we follow the dictates of our central characteristic, our ability to reason. Developing morality according to the dictates of reason shows us sometimes we're not that happy following the moral rules. But for those rules to be fair to everyone, happiness or pleasure seems beside the point. I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted here. I were to say to you, there are many circumstances where you felt like you did the right thing, you're convinced you did the right thing, you treated people equally or impartially or according to their merit, and you didn't like it, right? You might have felt unhappy with it. Whatever the circumstance, I might say what those are today. That intuition that it's not your feelings alone that dictate whether something is moral is perhaps in some ways best captured by a Kantian moral philosophy. Kant's going to argue in the second section of the overview that reason shows us to apply the same moral rule to everyone who's in a similar situation. So obviously not everybody is in a similar situation to you. Not everyone has to have the same moral rule applied to them or obligate them to act. But if someone's in a comparably similar situation, reason tells you that the rule they get to follow should be the rule that you get to follow if you were in those shoes. Kant's also going to argue that people are most human, therefore most moral, when exercising their faculty of reason. So it would be wrong to treat other people as mere things or objects or props. The mere here is important to use as we like. In other words, treating people merely as objects for your own benefit is to deny them their humanity and treat them as mere things or objects, and we'll see more about that shortly. Instead, we must treat other people as bearers of rational life, or as people who use their reasoning faculty to follow the life they choose, and not merely as instruments for our benefit or pleasure. This means, and we'll see this today, if we want another person to be part of our projects, You want to include people, family, friends, neighbors, people at school, people at work, in your projects. Reason tells us we must get them to agree or consent to a cooperative venture. If someone willfully and knowingly consents, there's a typo there, to then join your plan or project, we haven't treated them merely as a prop, but as a person that can make their own choices. So I'm going to skip back to the outline for a second. There we go. So that's sort of the goal for today. We're going to be looking at the late 18th century metaphysics of morals by Immanuel Kant. Kant made important contributions to philosophy, to politics, in some respects to science, although I'm sure modern day scientists would think they've done much better. In the passage provided here by the Florida State University professor, there are a couple points I want to point to. I'm not actually going to read the passage with you. I struggle every year when I teach this class with having people read as close as possible original texts. We did that with Mill. We'll do it later with translations of Aristotle. This particular translation of Kant, I think, let me flip over to it. It's through Gutenberg. Is it Gutenberg? So at the end. Yeah, that's a very old, as in, I think I remember it in college and grad school, set of translations that are free and on the internet. I wanted people to at least struggle with this to see the kind of structure of Kant's writing, but I'm not going to go through it step by step using the Kantian text. I think it's enough for you to sort of get a sense of it. I apologize that the text is difficult to read. Being free, it's an older translation. It's probably out of copyright protection. It's in the public domain. But I wanted you to at least try it. What I want to say about it here is in section A3, Kant emphasizes in this passage what makes our will, some of the readings for today call it our reason for acting, our maxim, our intention. These things aren't exactly the same, but they're close enough. What makes something good? What makes my motive, intention, reason for acting good in and of itself? Well, Kant says in this passage, it's not happiness or inclination or emotion. And if you think about it, just because you're happy to do something or you're inclined to do it naturally, right? You're sort of built that way or you've learned that as a habit, or emotionally you're happy to do something, doesn't give something its moral worth, right? It's not hard to think of examples. Someone might be happy being mean to people or might be happy being selfish. We wouldn't think that gives it moral worth. Well, of course, Kant wants to say if you're happy not being selfish, it's not the happiness that makes the act good, right? Because happiness itself can be pointed in a number of directions or act as a motive for doing a number of things. So what should, and this is 3C here in letter A, what should determine the will, what should guide us to act morally, is in Kant's view respect for duty, morality itself, using your reason to act in a situation that you could want anybody in the same or comparably similar situation to act. In other words, the motive to act should be to respect the moral law itself, to respect morality itself. So not happiness, not inclination, not it makes you feel good, not you're getting paid for it, not that you get promoted for it at work, just respect for morality itself. Well, that doesn't answer much of a question, because what does that mean? And here's Kant's answer, and it's we'll say more about it in letter B. And this is kind of a direct translation. I am never to act otherwise than so I could also will that my maxim could be a universal law. Sometimes this is called the universal law principle or formula. The verb you'll hear is, can you universalize the thing that you intended to do? If you can universalize it, we'll say more about that in a minute, then that counts as a moral act, right? I'm in B1, so this is one version of Kant's categorical imperative. We'll see a second version further along here in B. I'm going to read a little bit of B1 so I say it clearly. The sentence that we just finished, I'm never to act otherwise, right? This is Kant's moral rule that he believes anybody can follow and should follow. That is, if I can do it, if you're in my shoes, you should be able to do it. And if you can do something and I were in your shoes, I should be able to do it. It's universal, applies to all agents. Now, why is it called a categorical imperative? If you look at those words, they might give you something of a hint. It's categorical because this rule, do what others could do in your situation, applies in all situations without exception. I mean, that's what categorical means, right? Back in the day when Clinton was being deposed in a lawsuit that led to his impeachment, he was asked if he had sex in the White House with an intern, and with some lawyerly wrangling, he said something like, "I categorically deny it." And what he meant by categorical was in every description, in every situation, didn't happen. We know he was lying, right? But the point here is categorical means across the board, right? No exceptions. The categorical imperative, Kant's rule here, the universal law version, is imperative, I'm in B1, because it commands us as rational beings to follow. And you'll recall the Gertz, in our definition from 2 weeks ago, argue morality applies to all rational persons, and that if we're rational, we can't just opt out of morality like it's a game, right? That is very, very Kantian. The idea that Kant's getting across here, that the Gertz centuries later will emphasize, is if you're a rational agent and morality commands you to do something, you don't really have an option, right? Under pain of inconsistency or being a hypocrite or being disrespectful to others, you have to follow through on the rule that says, if I can do it, others in my situation can do it. I'm in B2 now. So Kant's famously difficult to read in English. I only have a reading translation in German. It's even harder there. So what I'm going to do now is turn to another text. This is a CSU professor I found online who I think does a decent job. As I go through his web pages, and I'll click on it in a minute, I'm going to offer my own commentary. He also comments on the two versions of Kant's categorical imperative, or CI. He first comments on the universal law formula, and it's called that, again, because it claims morality requires what we do and why we do it is moral only if we can want or will, absolutely anyone to do it if and when they were in our shoes. So let's go look at that CSU prof. It's not this one, so I'm going to close that screen. It's this one. All right, so what he tells you here is, in his abbreviated form on Kantian ethics, a basic summary. I'll start with that, and I might jump around a little, but I'll let you know where I'm headed. Certain things are absolutely prohibited, right? Regardless of how much pleasure or pain on balance they cause society, even in cases where the action would bring about more happiness. For Kantian, the two questions to ask: can I will rationally that everybody act as I propose? If yes, you're good. If no, you're not. And does my action respect the goals of human beings, and rather than merely use them? So the number one is the universal law formula, which we're going to see in a minute. Number two there is the end in itself formula, which we'll have to go back to the outline for. Kant's theory is an example of what's called deontological moral theory, that the rightness or wrongness of something does not depend on the consequences, but whether we do our intrinsically good duty. So here are examples of imperatives, hypothetical and categorical. I like this too, so I'm just going to stop with this. What's an imperative? It's a command. We talked about that. A hypothetical imperative is an imperative that commands conditionally. So if you're hungry, go eat something. There's nothing absolutely good or bad about eating or not eating, or being hungry or not hungry. But if you're hungry, you go do something, right? The condition is, I'm hungry, and then the command is, go eat. Categorical imperatives, again, to make a point, are different. Regardless of the situation, you shouldn't be cheating on your taxes, right? Even if people do it, I get it, right? And it might serve their interests. How does it work? Well, there are different formulations. This is the universal law formula. The quote you see here, act only on the maxim, though, through which you at the same time will, so you could command it for everybody, that it should be universal law of nature. So what does this mean? Translating 18th century German to 2020. What's a maxim? A maxim is the rule, reason, intention for why you're acting, right? His example is, I might make it my maxim to give as much to charity each year as I spend on eating. Maybe I decide that's an important thing. Haven't tested it yet. That's just like a basic, trial balloon. I'm going to see if it's going to work. The command states, and it's crudely, but that's fine, you're not allowed to do anything yourself that you would not be willing to allow everyone else to do as well. You're not allowed to make exceptions for yourself, right? Hypocrites do that. Everyone else has to pay their taxes, not me, right? And then the more detail, that's decent. I'm going to skip the section that follows here. The universal law formula, the categorical, applies in every case, imperative, command to you, is that every maxim, every reason you act, must be such that you're willing to make it that everyone else could act on it if they're in a similar situation. So his example here is, if I wanted to lie to get something I wanted, I've done that before, guilty. to be testing it to see if it's a moral rule. When you want something, you can't get it easily, you lie, or whatever. You have to be willing to make it the case that everyone could do that. Now, if you're willing to do that and there's no inconsistency, it doesn't seem disrespectful, doesn't use other people, you're probably good to go. You can imagine with the lying case, that's going to run into problems pretty soon. So let's skip the moral worth section. His image didn't show up, and that's fine. I'm going to skip this section here about why, well, I'll say something briefly. Why motivation is what matters. It shouldn't be that something is fun or happy that makes it moral, because lots of things that are fun or make you happy wouldn't make someone else happy. So you're not going to get a consistent rule out of that. Why consequences don't matter. Of course they do. People want to be in a world where happy things happen. But if you read this example, his point here is sometimes consequences are in your control, sometimes they're not. We don't think that determines someone's moral worth when they act. And of course, Kant doesn't think you shouldn't be happy, right? There's nothing wrong in principle with being happy. It's just that happiness alone isn't enough to make something moral. So let's talk about a case where lying, I'm going to skip that, sorry, would be wrong. Well, let's talk about a case of an action, a maxim, possible thing you would do would be wrong. He's got an example here. It's drawn kind of sort of out of Kant himself. Here's the maxim. Here's something you're thinking about doing, right? Example, I'm going to lie in a loan app when I'm in severe financial difficulty and there's no other way to get money. Okay, people, I'm sure, do it. Is that moral or not? Well, you might say moral if it makes you happy, but of course it's going to make a lot of other people unhappy, people at the bank. So maybe that's hard to sort out, right? Some sort of happiness test like we saw with Mill. So here's how we do it in a Kantian framework with the universal law formula. This is under number 2. Everyone lies on a loan app when they're having financial problems, when there's no other to get money. Now, his number 3 here, and this is particular to the way some people teach Kant, is imagine some weird, he calls it perturbed social world, where that second example, everybody does it, was known, right? Everybody did it. Everyone knew it was out there. Would there be some sort of contradiction or problem? I'll skip the 2 questions below about that. Well, it isn't hard to figure out. If I want to lie in a loan app to get money because I need it, the test says everyone in my shoes should be able to do it. Well, of course, if everybody should be able to do it, everybody knows that they should be able to do it, no one's going to loan any money, right? I mean, no one's going to go through with that if they knew the rule is everyone is lying. Then loan making doesn't happen, in which case there's a contradiction between I expect everyone can do it and, of course, no one's going to do it. So in Kant's version here, it fails, right? Because you can't possibly have it happen past the sort of universal law test. You could look at the indifference to needs of other example. Actually, let's do that just really quickly. Here's a maxim. To advance my own interests, I'm not going to help anyone else unless I have something to get out of it. Okay, I imagine some people do that. Right? Maybe some people give to charity just because they get a tax break. So I'm going to help others in need, but there's got to be something for me. The PSW here he calls the perturbed social world. This is a world where your maxim, only give to charity if it gets you something, is the rule. Well, let's universalize that. If I can do it for me, you should be able to do it for you. Would we want to live in a world where everybody, to advance his interests, only did it when they had something to gain? He says here, kind of cleverly, you might think cynically, this is the world we lived in. But in the second paragraph, the however, I couldn't choose to live in the world where everybody only helped others because there was something in it for them. In other words, you couldn't really live in this kind of world, right? Look, well, you can read the Kantian phrase, because a will which resolved itself this way would contradict itself, because there are going to be cases where you need something and someone says, sorry, nothing in it for me, I'm not giving it to you. In other words, you can't universalize without lots of problems. The principle, only give if there's something in it for you, because if it were universal and you needed something and it was nothing in it for them to give to you, they wouldn't give to you. So that's sort of the universal law version. You can compare it to utilitarianism. Most every ethics class does. I kind of like his example here about someone who gets a deathbed wish and is told to give it to the protection of the society to control against alien control of the earth. So my best friend dies, and he says, give all my money to this weird protect Earth from aliens group. And I go, yeah, I'll do that. And then my friend dies, and I'm like, well, wait a minute. I don't think that's really going to help because I don't think the aliens are landing here. I'll go give it to UNICEF or some kind of charity that does good here in Austin. If you were to test this maxim, and here he does it, formulate the maxim, I am to break a deathbed promise when it will allow me to do more good for humanity, so that money can go somewhere else. Here's the universal law rule version. Everyone can break a deathbed promise when they think that breaking the promise does better for humanity. Now, you might think if it's common knowledge that everyone does this, everyone breaks deathbed promises, sorry, hard to say, no one's going to ask for them, right? If I live in a world where I know anybody, because it's permissible on a universal law test, is never going to honor a promise made on a deathbed, I'm not going to ask you to make one, and you're not going to get to make one. So in this sense, because not everybody can do it in my shoes, the rule fails. Now, if you're a utilitarian, and you can look at the consequences here, totally different test. You might say, okay, I'll give it to the weird alien group. Probably not going to help much, but at least I made one guy happy when he was dying. I could give the money to some group that really, really needs it. Probably, famine relief or right here now in U.S. during the pandemic. Probably won't get discovered. So the utilitarian says, go ahead and do it. So it's a very different kind of calculation here than what Kant would say. Let me go back to the outline. So a second version of the categorical imperative is called the end in itself formula. And here it is in Kant's words. Let me give you the outline again. It's B3. So act as to treat humanity, both in your own person, so this is a duty you have to yourself, and in the person of every other, so it's all other people, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. Okay, this is kind of a mouthful, but in sum, and I'm going to go through the next page and a half with you, in sum, what this is saying is when I treat other people, I cannot merely treat them as things. I have to treat them as human beings that are autonomous, make their own decisions, rational, make their own decisions because they have the facility of reason, right? They can decide for themselves what's good and what's bad and how to pursue their lives and so on. And if I treat them as less than that, I've sort of demoted them from person status to thing status. So explain this, I'm in B3. I'm going to say a few things here, and I'm going to finish by drawing on the O'Neill article I asked people to read. Not all of it, I realize it was a little dense, but in pages 261 to 266, some of the conditions for consent are spelled out. And if consent is important for not treating people merely as objects, we need to know what consent is. So what does it mean, I'm in B3 little a here, to treat someone merely as a means, and that merely is important, and not as an end or as a person with their own dignity and autonomy and rights and choices. I'm in B here. To treat someone as a mere means is to deny their humanity or their agency, their ability to choose, as a rational being, or deny their freedom to make choices. So this is C. I imagine everyone's been, sadly, had the experience of merely being used by somebody else. Here's D, my example. And I'm going to change the names. I had a friend in grad school, a guy I live with. We'll call him Sam. He didn't have a car, and I did. And so he used to borrow it all the time without asking. And, it's one of those roommate things. What are you going to do? He's not my insurance, but he's probably a good driver, and I'm not using it all the time, but it's my car. And so you can sort of see the kind of discussion that's going on. What's wrong with this? Now, let's assume I did not give him in advance permission to do it. In fact, I didn't. Right? I parked it up front, but I never said, take it whenever you want. So I'm on letter E here, so 3E. Sam here on my example doesn't get my permission. He just wants to use my car. At that moment, when Sam just takes the car and doesn't ask me, I'm not really a person to Sam. I'm not a person who has my own plans to use the car or, maybe lend it to somebody else or whatever. Of course, Sam doesn't care if I was going to use the car or care if I'd say yes or no. I mean, that's the whole point. If he cared, he'd ask me in advance. At the moment when he doesn't ask, I've been treated as a mere object or instrumentalized. I know it's a big word. And I've become a mere tool to Sam. In other words, I don't really count as a person. I'm just someone with a car, or rather an obstacle, because what he really wants is the car, and that's all he thinks about me. So what's wrong with this? And this is letter F here. In Kantian language, Sam is denied my personhood my free choice to live my life, use my car or not use my car, as I see fit. By instrumentalizing me, Sam has reduced my humanity from a real person capable of free choice, making rational plans on his own, to a mere thing. This is disrespectful, as anyone, I imagine, listening to this could say. When people ride roughshod over you just for your money or your bank or your car, the paradigm example people often use is in romantic or sexual relations, right? The disrespect of another person that's clearly involved, right, in assault and rape. What does that mean? Well, one, on Kantian terms, you're just using the other person as an object. You don't care about their consent, their choice, their plans, their hopes, their dreams. So even if it's not that extreme and that terrible, it's just about using someone's car without asking. The principle here is the same. To disrespect somebody else's nature, their rational nature, their autonomy and choice, is to not get their consent when you decide to involve them in a project of your own. I'm in G. Now, this wouldn't pass the universal law test because if someone's going to borrow your car without asking, and then the test, this is the test we just did, this is not the one we're headed towards, the test we just did says, can I universalize that? Well, can anyone just borrow anybody else's car without asking in advance? And of course, the answer is no. That happened, people wouldn't have cars, or they'd guard them with their lives, or there'd be fights over cars because yours was always subject to being taken against your will. So clearly Sam's decision just to use my car without asking fails the universal law test. This is G. But now let's ask if anybody could just take property without asking. And if they did, it doesn't take to see, as we just did, how much that Sam's actions, right, don't hold up, they're wrong. Now I'm in H. How does Sam's maxim, reason for acting, fail the end in itself formula? That's the one we're doing now, involving treating people as mere objects and not as people in themselves. There is a simple answer we can provide, and then we're going to get to O'Neill's response. It'll sort of flesh it out. I'm an I. The simple answer here is that Sam has denied my autonomy or my choice to freely decide what to do with my car. Now, he asked me first, before taking it, I could decide on my own, free choice, rational choice, to say yes, like it's fine. If I said yes and he takes the car, now he's not treating me as an object or a way to get a car, but as a person who has the freedom to say yes or no. Asking for consent and getting it means he's followed the rule, respected my freedom to choose and act, treating me with dignity, right? He doesn't have to say, like some big fancy speech, you are a dignified human being and I will get your consent before taking your car. But I think if he's going to honor me as a person, as a friend, someone who makes his own choices, someone who decides what his own life is going to be, he better say first, hey, can I borrow your car? If I say yes, he's in the clear. Now I'm going to jump to J, and I'm going to draw from the O'Neill article, because if at this point you're asking, well, what goes into consent? How does one know that there is a way of consenting that honors the other person's freedom and choice and dignity and autonomy? O'Neill, in Kantian fashion, she's a British philosopher that has written a lot about Kant, does summarize the importance of consent, to treat others with dignity and respect. Now, in the passage I asked you to read, she emphasizes several features that, when satisfied, I'm in J, manage to treat other persons not simply as tools or things or props. Those features include, and here's my own language, to give meaningful consent, someone has to be informed, so you have to have enough information. So I can't be given false information or misleading information. Second, to give meaningful consent, someone has to be free to choose or not. So if I'm coerced or under duress or threatened, there's no real freedom there. In that case, I'm not being treated with respect and dignity. You don't really care, right? Because you're going to threaten me or coerce me to pressure me to act. And if I'm pressured or coerced in the wrong way, in a way that doesn't honor my free choice, then you haven't really secured my consent. What you've done is you've pushed me to do something that maybe I didn't want to do. And again, that's to treat me merely as an object. So one, you got to have information. Two, you got to be free to say yes or no. Three, you got to have the cognitive capacity or rationality to understand what's going on here. So babies don't qualify as rational decision makers. People with certain cognitive deficits, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and so on. In some circumstances, you might say, well, I was so high or drunk, that I couldn't really rationally say yes. And you can decide what that limit is, but the principle there is easy enough to follow, right? And then 4, O'Neill adds, what she says is if you're in a meaningful relationship, the consent must be secure with a personal touch. This is something above and beyond the consent of the person that you would interact with at Target when buying something, or maybe someone in the financial aid office who fills out a form. She seems to argue here that consent, when the relationship is important, friends, spouses, lovers, that kind of thing, it's not enough that I make a free, uncoerced, and informed choice. The tone has to show some sort of respect for the other part. So here's an example. Not a real example, but could happen. I have 4 siblings. That part's true. Betsy, Tom, Fran, Steve. Let's suppose Steve, my youngest brother, calls me on the phone. He asks to borrow some money for a down payment on a car. Now this is K. Let's say he wants to borrow $1,000. Now suppose he says he's going to be paying me back in 2 months. He just doesn't have the cash right now. But let's suppose secretly he has no intention of doing that at all, right? He's not going to pay me back. Of course, he doesn't tell me that, right? And let's add that he says if I don't lend him the money, he'll tell my current girlfriend, my partner, they had an affair with an old girlfriend when I met that old girlfriend at an academic conference. Now, that's not true. I've been completely, totally faithful to my partner. But Steve's a lawyer and very convincing, so he knows, 1, he better not tell me, sorry to knock on lawyers, but it's easy. He's not going to tell me he's not going to pay me back. And 2, he's going to push me to loan him the money by holding over my head this false threat of a real threat about a false affair. How has he violated the universal law formula? Well, that might be easy. That's the previous form that we talked about, right? Can we universalize this? Lie to get money that you want from a sibling. Don't intend to pay him back. Well, no one's going to lend money if that's universal. And threaten him a little bit with a false story about infidelity. Well, maybe that universal relationships wouldn't survive very long. So here we have something different. How does it violate the end in itself formula? And this is L, I think. Here Steve doesn't tell me he will not pay me back. If he did that, of course, I'm not going to lend him any money. Probably. Maybe some people are okay with that. I wouldn't be. But if I now agree to lend him the money, don't know he's not going to pay me back, he has not really treated me as a person. He's treated me like an ATM machine. How? 1, he failed to secure my consent, right? I wasn't properly informed about his plan. He gave me false information about repayment. 2, he's trying to coerce me with that threat of infidelity. It doesn't matter if it's not true. It's going to hurt my relationship, and I'll feel the pressure. I might be like, well, I'll lend him the money. I don't need to have a fight with my girlfriend because my brother's lying. And 3, I do have the cognitive capacity to understand what he wants, say I'm rational. So that part of the test I pass. Now, you might argue here, I'm not really rational because I've been coerced with a threat. We could argue that, but I won't. So let me just say, sort of as a side note here, what counts as a free, informed, rational choice is contextual, right? Someone out there might argue, you're not really rational if he's threatening you with that infidelity story, so he's failed that one too. Someone else could say, no, you're a philosophy professor, you're smart enough to figure out that the threat's not real, or to tell your girlfriend in advance that the story's coming and it's not real, and to weigh the pros and cons. We could get into the weeds on that, but just for the time being, I'm going to say what counts here is that I caught myself as rational. Lastly, his lying promise and coercive threats certainly lacks the personal touch. Yeah, there's no one, I think, would argue here that my brother lying and threatening me to get a loan satisfies the sort of civility and respect that siblings owe each other. So that's sort of, 7, I don't know if we've been 33 minutes in a nutshell with Kant. You can still go back and read those articles, the web article and any of the ones that I've talked about here. But you've got the basic idea, I hope, is that if we are rational beings, morality shouldn't be determined by some happiness calculation or what makes us feel good. Those are hard to do and seem rather inconstant, and they're going to differ by person. We wanted a test that applied to everyone in the same way, treated everybody with dignity and respect, and let them make free choices on their own. A test that would say, if you can do it, I can do it in your shoes, or if you do something with to for me, you better get my permission first, because otherwise you're not treating me as a full human being. That's sort of Kant in a nutshell. I'm going to take a break and walk away from the screen and come back. When we come back, I want to see a Kantian kind of argument not about lying and paying money and making promises on their deathbed. Let me get out of this. But I'll get you the article by a fellow who, by permission of the author, I have this article here in Canvas, named Harry Gensler. Let's see if I can open it up. He's a philosopher in the Midwest, I think in Ohio. I think he still works there. And in particular, let me see if I can get the article. I want to get to page 89 to 94, and I will scroll to that point. You can maybe read that for a second, where he makes a Kantian kind of argument about abortion. He doesn't make a utilitarian one. If you read the earlier pages, he says, you know, you don't want to decide decisions like abortion or euthanasia or whatever based on the outcomes, because those two change. He thinks this Kantian kind of argument gets him a very strong, and I'm going to use the word just because that's what's in political parlance, pro-life position. Don't have to agree with them. Do want you to sort of allow it to follow through, because you're going to give him principle of charity the chance to make the argument. If you don't think it works, there's going to have to be some logical defect in one of these steps. And from 89 to 94, he lays out sort of what the argument looks like first, and then he does a whole bunch of sort of right question and wrong question hypotheticals for how it works. We'll try to summarize how it's a Kantian kind of argument. We'll do that first. That's right here. And then we'll do the argument, maybe look at a couple of objections, and then we'll be done. So let's take a break here, maybe a minute and a half, and I will come back and we'll do the piece in front of you. Okay, hi, I'm back. So let's take a look at Gensler's argument. He says right here on 89, my argument, my approach to abortion stresses consistency. So he uses that plus some other kind of principles he throws in. So let's walk through this and then his right question and wrong question examples. He says, and we saw with Kant, consistency is important. If I can do something in a similar situation, you should be able to do it. And if in a similar situation you and everyone else can't do it, there's got to be something wrong with that potential act, right? So it's not moral. So reading right from 89, this is Gensler. If you're consistent, think it's all right, he means morally, for someone to do A to X, whatever A is, it's an action, X is a person, then you think it's all right for someone to do A to you. That sounds like Kant's universal law formula, right? It's okay for someone to do saying A to person X. You're saying it's okay to do to you if the situations are similar, right? If they're way different situations, that doesn't matter, right? If you're consistent, you think it's all right for someone to do A to you, then you'll consent to it. And that's the second version of the categorical imperative we just saw. So if it's okay to do something to me, it's kind of like I'm saying, yeah, I agree. It's, go ahead. And if I'm consistent and it's all right to do something A to an X, then I'll consent to being done to you under similar circumstances. And he calls that the golden rule. He gives you a defense here of these things, right? The first premise is the universal liability principle, similar judgments of the same sort of situation. So I'm on line 4, page 90. I think it would be okay to rob Jones, but I don't think it would be all right to rob me. Then there's something wrong with that, right? Again, with Jones and I are in a similar situation. Second premise he calls the prescriptivity principle. Don't have to worry about the word. That as long as our ethical beliefs are in harmony with the rest of our lives. So I'm about midway down the page. If I think an act will be all right, but I don't consent to it being done, then I'm inconsistent. If it's all right, you got to agree to it, right? And the conclusion is just a form of the golden rule. This is 4 lines from the bottom of this first paragraph, line 90. If I think it's all right to rob Jones, but I don't consent to it, idea of someone robbing me when we're in a similar situation, I've broken the rule. So let's find out some examples. If you're consistent, you think stealing's okay normally. Oh, sorry, that's my elder dog, Casper. Then you'll consent to it. Of course, you don't consent to it, right? You're consistent. You don't want people stealing from you. So if you don't consent to it, then it's like saying you don't think stealing is generally okay. Ah, sounds fine. Then he gives you several right way, wrong ways of understanding this. Here's a question you might ask. Silly one, but philosophers do this. Do I think it's permissible to rob somebody when they're asleep? Well, no. Right? The right way to ask about this, do I consent to being robbed when I'm asleep? Because if I say it's okay to rob people when they're asleep, it's like I'm saying, I agree for you to do that to me. Right? Now, the wrong question here, as he points out, is not if I were robbed while asleep, would I consent then? Well, no, people don't consent when they're asleep. So again, what you're trying to say here is, if you're consistent, and if I say it's okay to rob somebody else, then what I'm saying is I'm consenting to them robbing me. And of course, I don't consent to that. So it must fail some sort of Kantian golden rule test. Okay, so he's got a whole bunch of other ones. These are hypotheticals. He says as much here. This is the one on the bottom of 91. Do I think it's permissible to violate someone's will after they die? Well, let me think. The test I used to say, the way I used to say this in person classes, one of 5 kids. My father has an estate. He was a successful banker. He made me the executor. It's true, he didn't trust all the lawyers in my family. Here's a question I might think. Well, he wants me to give everybody an equal share, my 4 siblings and I. Do I think that's permissible? If he were to pass, God hope not, just to change the will and give myself all the money? The right way to think about that is, do I consent to the idea of my will being violated? Don't have all that much in my life, but if I were to pass, God forbid, I'd want my 2 sons and my girlfriend to get equal shares, right? So if it's okay for me to violate my dad's will after he dies, it'd be okay for someone to do that to me, and I'm not okay with that. I don't agree. My desires are consistent. We should treat people in similar situations, similar ways. So no, that would be wrong. He says here, the wrong question, if my will is violated after my death, would I then consent? Well, no, you're dead. Dead people don't consent. Okay. And here's where he's going to up the ante and ask, do I think it's permissible, this is page 92, to blind X, well, X is a fetus. I know this sounds horrible, but philosophers ask hypotheticals all the time that are meant to illustrate a point, even though they sound really disgusting and creepy and gross. Well, why would anyone want to give a drug to a woman who is pregnant to blind the fetus? I mean, it just sounds gross. But let's suppose, you're Dr. Evil and you want to do it. Or for those of you who are geeks like me, you've got the TARDIS, Doctor Who, take it back in time, and you say to somebody, having a kid that sees is kind of annoying because he's always putting his finger in outlets and stoves, and he's kind of annoying, so let's just blind your kid now. And of course, the question that pregnant woman should say to the evil Doctor Who, going back in time to, when she was pregnant, maybe she's got a kid now who's 5 or 6, do I consent to the idea of having been blinded while fetus? Well, no. Of course, fetuses can consent, but if you're asking me now, if I want someone to go back in time to be consistent, if I said, yes, you could do it to some other kid in the past, so he would be blind or she would be blind in the future, it's got to be okay to do to me. Well, I don't want it done to me. I mean, my vision's not great, but I don't want to be blind. So that would be wrong. Okay. And then he has a whole bunch of other cases. Let me get to the abortion case, because this is the one that's going to be, this is the bottom of 93. And I imagine somebody listening to this in this lecture is going to think I'm pro-choice on abortion, has something like the following position. That choice is up to the woman, because she's carrying the fetus, the baby. No one gets to tell her to do what to do with her body or coerce her to do what with her body. It sounds very Kantian. She should be allowed to have an abortion if she wants. Perhaps she has it for perfectly good medical reasons. Perhaps, as was the case in my birth, my mom had 6 kids. Every one of them was very, very difficult and potentially risky. So maybe women should have the choice to abort for that reason. Or whatever reason, right? Whatever the law permits. Gensler's going to be arguing against that in the following Kantian way. If you're consistent, think abortion's permissible, some of you are out there and have had that position, then you're going to consent to that it would be okay to you having been aborted. And he says in normal circumstances, and we'll have to say more about that in a second. Now he thinks, top of 94, you're not going to consent to that, right? Apologize now, my dog's doing his back scratch freak out thing. So you're going to hear some doggy sounds. He's going to think, well, no one's going to say if it's okay in general everyday life for women today to have an abortion and it's morally permissible. I would consent to having my mom have had an abortion, pick the birth date for you. For me, it's January of 1965. He thinks you're not going to be able to say yes to that second one. You can't say that I'm going to consent to it, because of course if you consented to it, you wouldn't be around now. You'd be gone. And that would be really sad, and you would experience all the wonderful things of going to St. Ed's and having friends and experience reading books and watching movies, doing all the things now we're doing. Sorry, that's my dog sneezing. Inside the house. So if you're consistent, top of 94, you won't think it's normally, regularly, for the most part, permissible. Usually when I teach this, people say, okay, I am consistent. I wouldn't want anyone to go back in time and blind me before I was born. I wouldn't want them to make me not hear or make me have some kind of challenges that I don't have. And I'm completely consistent about that, because I wouldn't do it to someone else. I'm sorry, my dog's being really loud. You have to take a minute. Casper. So I'm consistent, and I wouldn't do it to somebody else because I wouldn't want them to do it to me. That is, go back in time and take my hearing, give my mom that hearing drug or blindness drug, make my life more difficult pre-birth. Completely consistent about that. Wouldn't want it done to me, wouldn't do it to somebody else. But now you're thinking, if you're pro-choice and abortion, well, yeah, I would be okay, not with having been blinded before I was born, or deaf, or having some sort of difficulty, but I would be okay if the evil Doctor Who went back in time and said to my mom before my birth, yeah, you've got an option here. The future kid they're about to have says it's okay, she consents, he consents to not being around, and he or she thinks they're consistent about that. And I want to argue a little bit with Gensler, and then we'll do his objections, that he might have a point here. This could be for the Casper. Cage. The difficulty with being with the dogs all day is they want to be with you all the time, and then want to be walked all the time. So I'm going to suggest this. You say you're pro-choice, fine, that it's a woman's body and her choice and her right, and she gets to make the decision. Gensler says, okay, you wouldn't go back in time and tell your mom it's okay to blind the future you, or make the future you not hear, or whatever, any more than you go back in time and you'd say to someone in the past, go ahead, steal from past me, or, rob my apartment or whatever. So no, I'm not consenting to that. I'm consistent with my desires. I don't think I should do it to others, so therefore I don't want anyone else to do it to me. But here, in this one case, you want to argue against Gensler, I'm assuming, because you're pro-choice. No, I am consistent. I think it's permissible. I will consent to having been aborted. When you get to premise 2 in the top of 94, he says you don't consent to it because, you want to be around, you want to be alive, you want to experience things. No, I'm okay with that, because this one thing, not the damage to past me or robbing past me, but ending the life of past me so there's no future me, this one I'm okay with. He wants to say, when you're not being consistent with your desires, right? That, frankly, if you really don't want to be harmed in the past or have your stuff taken in the past because future you is going to be around to see and hear and grow and have experiences, Why would you want someone to go in the past and kill past you before you were born? So there is no future you. And usually when I teach this article, people say something like this. Jack, if you went back in time, I was born in New York, and said to your mom, I'm child number 3. Whew, it's New Year's Eve, and he's going to be born next month. He's going to be really difficult. He's his future Jack. Go ahead and, avoid the philosopher of the future and the difficulty and the not calling you on your birthday. Go ahead and do it. If she went ahead and did it, and I've seen enough sci-fi movies with time travel to know, past me would never be born. At that moment where she had an abortion and past me died, future me would disappear because there was no future me. Forget about timelines of time travel. Let's just assume it's a straight line. And you wouldn't know your future was gone. And I think I want to say is, yeah, I wouldn't know because then I disappear in the future as well. But there's something wrong with that, right? I want to have a life. I want to do things. I want to grow. I eventually want this pandemic to end so I can travel and see people and see things. So I'm with Gensler here. I'm consistent. I don't think it's normally permissible. There might be some cases where it is, but in my case, not really, right? Even child 3 of 6. I don't consent to having been aborted in the circumstances my mom faced because I wanted to have seen, the verb tenses are all messed up, have seen this terrific future life. And I'm consistent, and I don't think people should go back in time and tell their moms before birth, in this one case, you can end the life because there won't be a future life to be had and to be missed. I would miss it. I want it, and I know I want all of you around too, right? I want this pandemic to end. I want you to get to campus, and I want there to be a vaccine and take off the masks and the plastic plexiglass and go to sporting events and all those terrific things. And if I'm really consistent and I say, I want those things, that should be pro-life. That's kind of Gensler's position. He's got some objections. He talks about the utilitarian example. It leads to strange implications. He says, what about a non-utilitarian? He says, well, I've got an interesting set of choices for that person. Top of 95. Do you consent to the idea of blinding you now? No. How about blinding you yesterday? No. You don't consent to that either? No. When you were 5? No. When you were 1 day old? No. No one wants to be born blinded before they were born. No. But then before you were born, it's okay? No. If you really, really value all those things, you don't just value your sight today, and you won't agree to being blinded today. You don't value your sight when you were 5, and you wouldn't agree to go back in time and blind the 5-year-old you. And you wouldn't consent to it before birth because you want to have sight and you want to do a whole bunch of stuff. And if you're consistent with all that, he gets you. But if somehow you don't want any of those harms to take place, but you're okay with the harm of going back in time and ending the life that was you, that would be you, that is you, and we're glad you're here, then he wants to say, well, golly, that's just not consistent, right? It's not willing something that anyone in your shoes could do because it ends the future you. Let me see if I can do another one of those arguments here. Let's do the normal circumstance one. Because notice his argument here. See if I can go back. I'm going to do objection 6 here. We go back. I think it was on 84. Oh, sorry. Flipping around here. Yeah, here we go. This is on the bottom of 93. If you're consistent, you think abortion is normally permissible. I'm sure people in the class have that view. You'll consent to it. Because if it's permissible, you're saying you're going to agree to it. And if you're permissible and you're agreeing to it, you're saying if others can do it to others, then others can do it to you. And of course, he thinks you don't want it done to you because you want to be around. Right? So he now gets to objection 6. And you know what he said? Under normal circumstances. And he says, suppose I'm consistent. I can't hold that abortion is normally permissible. What if I don't care about being consistent? Right? Can you prove that I should care? And he goes, you ask too much. If I give you an argument of proving that abortion's wrong, you ought to care about being consistent. If you don't care about consistency, why should you not accept the premises of my argument and yet reject the conclusion? That would be inconsistent. But you don't care about this. So I guess he wants to say as well, if you don't care about being consistent, I don't even know what to say to you, right? Because in every other case, you were saying, I'm agreeing to something being done, which means I'm consenting to it, which means I'm consenting to others doing it to me in similar circumstances. Don't want to be robbed in the past, don't want to be blinded in the past, don't want to be blinded, have my hearing taken away from me in the past, don't want to be harmed in any way in the past. But I'll have one kind of harm that's not even you can't come back from. I mean, the one is where my life has ended in the past. That one you're okay with. Seems to me if you have desires, and I'll put words in his mouth, normal desires to sort of want to experience things and go to school and have jobs and grow and have friends, agreeing to the thing that would take away all of that seems to deny that you really value all those things. So, and that's not exactly his argument. I've tried to craft it. So, yeah, we're almost an hour, so I should probably wrap things up. So next week, let me give you a heads up on next week. Week 4, and I'll send email at sometime tonight about the papers. I'm almost done grade emails. I'll let you know about that. What is next for? It should be virtue theory or mill. Virtue theory. So we're going to change gears next time. Talk about a theory that goes all the way back to Aristotle. And the Catholic Church was taken up by Thomas Aquinas, and in the 70s and 80s, 50s through the 80s, sort of had a resurgence, which is the moral thing to do is not calculated by consequences, pardon, not a function of rationality and consistency, what we're doing now, but a function of character, right? Characters that are learned by habits over time and affect the kind of person you are. So that's where we're headed. Questions, again, don't feel free to send them my way. Set up set up time to meet. I may change the office hours this week in order to get you papers back, get you 2 days to think about them. And I think that's it. So let me go back to, there we go. All right, well, let me stop this, and we will see you next week. Let's see.